Hey peeps! Alright, so what we have here is a telescope, and we're going to build a crazy joint base rig for this particular prop. And what I want to show you or kind of focus on is how to selectively bind joints to single objects, and then how local rotation axes work on joints so that you can control how to set that up and how that works. So bear with me, here we go. First steps. I'm going to place my main joint. So I'm just going to go to create joint, and I'm going to drop it. I'm going to put it right here. Oh, I'm like, well, where's my joint? I can't see it. Well, you need to turn on this, which is X-ray joints, so you can actually see it in the window. And I snapped it to grid so that it would be at 0, 0, but it's only translated in the Y. And then I'm going to hold V down and move it up so it's right there. So it's right at the center of that. So I'm going to make this my one of my main neck joints. This is going to be the joint for that. So I'm going to name it. I'm going to call it neck joint. And then I'm just going to duplicate the neck joint. I'm going to move it down somewhere about here, and I'm going to call this my main joint. All right. And from there, I need to do one for each one of these legs. And I'm going to put a joint chain in here so I can mess with the deformation a little bit. But let me build the base structure first. The other thing I'm going to do right here is I'm going to add an extra joint, which I'm affectionately going to call the end effector joint. So now's a good time to talk about like local rotation axes. So to turn those on so I can see them, I've made a hotkey on my shelf here that if you just select all of these and you hit this, bam, you get that. And what a local rotation axis is it's showing the direction where all the joints are pointing, the rotation of the joints are pointing. So if I were to hit, this joint, hit E, you can see that, oh, there's X and here's Y and here's Z and how it's going to rotate. Well, typically with joint chains, what you want is the X-axis to follow down the joint. In order to get good solid rotation. So to do that, first let me show you how to turn this bad boy on. You can do it up here by going to transform display local rotation axes. And so all I did was just hold shift down and make a shelf button real quick. Okay, so I want these to orient so X is running down the whole chain. Well, there's a really cool thing that they added under skeletons called orient joints, which is right here. And the default looks like this. Well, I want my primary axis to be my X and my secondary axis to be my Y. And if I select all these and I go apply, what you're going to notice is everything's going to run down X, which is great. In order to get that to work, because I want you to see what the very last local rotation axis looks like. In fact, X isn't going forward at all. So in order for it to, you use this joint as kind of like a placeholder or like a target, if you will, for it to be able to get those joints oriented. Now, once you're done with your rig completely, you could just delete that joint, because I've got my local rotation axes already set, so there's no reason to keep that joint on the rig. Now, obviously I haven't placed them correctly, because if you look here, so I want my joints at 0, to run straight down that path. Well, it's stuck here. So I'm going to grab all of these and I'm going to move them over. Okay, so let's do the back joint. Now this is definitely tricky because it's on an angle. And the other thing I want you to notice here is that the local rotation doesn't line up with this. So there's another way that you can adjust the local rotation axis on these joints. So that involves using these up here, which are called selection masks. So I'm going to turn on my local rotation axis. And then I'm going to go into component mode. And I'm going to select this little question mark right there. When you have the question mark selected, it will let you grab the axes. And notice I'm rotating the joint, but its rotation value isn't changing. Once I have that set, now you see the rotation axis is set just like that. And the translation is great, but the rotations are normal. So I've got that sort of at the angle that I want it and generally about where I want it in space. Try there. Okay, so I'm gonna name it. I'm gonna call it leg joint. And I'm gonna call this front left leg. And I'm going to dupe it. And this one doesn't have, so I haven't modeled, this wasn't modeled to deform. And I don't feel like creating deformations on this one. So I'm just going to make a stiff bind on that. So I'm just going to use this and I'm going to ping it down here. And I'm going to connect it right there. So I'm going to go and hold V down. I'm going to drop it right on that. So that it snaps somewhere close to where the center is. Now why this is helpful, check it out, is I can grab this, parent it underneath it. I'm going to look at the local rotation axis. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to go back up to skeleton, orient joint, and boom. It throws the X right down the joint to that particular space. Now again, I could delete that one underneath it if I'm so inclined. All right, so now I've got one leg. All right, so all I got to do is do the same thing, make another leg. So I could take this leg, and providing this is in the center, I could group it. Okay. And now I'm going to take this pivot and I'm going to snap it to this joint. What I should be able to do is duplicate this, rotate it, but what's cool about this is I'm just using this to kind of create the legs so I don't have to rebuild them from scratch. So now all I need to do is get these to be approximately in the center. All right, now that I got all those joints oriented, time to hook them up to the main. So I'm going to grab that, and I'm going to slide it under the main. And so now each leg, you should be able to see, each leg has its own joint chain, and all the axes are pointing down the leg properly. All right. So now what I'm going to do is I'm essentially just going to grab this joint, and I'm going to grab this geo. Okay. So the left front leg. All right. And I'm just going to bind it. And I'm going to use selected joints. Well, first, remember, always reset, selected joints. And you can use classic linear. It's no big deal for this. That's not going to be an issue. So I'm just going to hit apply because there's only one joint. So if I were to rotate this now, hey, that's going to move with it. Yay! So let's say, you know what? Let's say I do want to add, I want to insert a joint. I want to put a joint right there. How would I do that? All right, well, so there is something called insert joints. And if you click on the bone, see, I just added it. There it is. So if I take this joint, now that I have it, off the main, I can then take the joint and put it between the main and the neck. And so I'm going to call this head joint. So see on neck one, I'm going to take that and I'm just going to move it right there. Okay, so let me get the head joint where I want it. And then I'm going to put the neck underneath the head. Now, there might be an issue with this. Let's see what the local axes look like. So I want these two to go up that way. So I'm going to grab this one, head and neck, just those two, and I'm going to try orienting. And now their X is going straight that way, and Y is going that way, Z is going that way. So now it's following down that chain. And then this one didn't alter. So let's get back to binding. So I'm going to bind this piece to the main. Skin, bind skin. Then I'm going to bind this piece just to the head. Select. Because I don't want it to be affected by the rotation of neck. Again, make sure I'm still selected joints, and I'm going to hit bind skin. All right, great. Then I'm going to grab neck and neck one. And then I'm going to go all the way down. Grab that, because it's the whole piece, right? And I'm going to bind it. But this time, I'm going to change these settings a little bit. Because I want to make sure that I use dual quaternarian, so it tries to hold the volume a little bit better. I'm also not 100% sure if this mesh has any non-manifold stuff on it. So if it was a bad or weird mesh, I might then try geodesic voxel. I'm going to try closest distance first, and we'll see what happens. And if it binds, okay, great. So now when I grab this, hey, I got a noodly. And when I grab that, there should be no, look at that, smooth as silk. And when I grab this, yep, all's well that ends well. All right. So now that I got everything bound, and it actually works, I would probably save it. What you want to be careful about is because you don't have an easy zero state, and it's real simple to mess things up, because you'll notice again you can't freeze transform joints. So if, for instance, I move this and I'm like, oh, I could just type this into 0. Oh, oh look, 0. See, it's doing some weird stuff, man. It's compressing those joints. So you don't want, you want to be very careful about how you, when you're moving joints and stuff around, which is why you want to use a control rig when you're really testing motion. Okay, so I've got it set, it's ready to go. Next step, we just got to add a control rig to it. So I've done at this point, I've done a selective bind. I've walked you through local rotation axes, and I've shown you how to set up a clean, joint base break. Next, what we're going to be doing is setting up the controls for this sucker. And this has a particular problem or challenge with it, and it's these joints that are set at angle, especially for an animator. And it's a little tricky to set up the controls for it because you won't be able to freeze transformations on the controls like we have been doing in the past. So I'm going to talk about the process for that. All right, so let me just start by getting things set up with the control rig, the basics. I'm going to use a square for the master. Now keep in mind that this is lining up with the rotation axis, the local rotation axis on this. That's why this is set that way. That's why the curve seek is here's the x. And remember, I made the x point up this joint. So if I wanted this to lay flat by default, I would want the y pointing up on it. So let's take a look at that for a second. So I want the animator to be able to click it and naturally rotate the direction that it's going to go. This is only going to go one direction. And so I can rotate these, right? And I could come through and grab it and I can freeze. So see, that's like that. I can freeze transforms, and notice it's, that's fine. This is going to be the x. It's just going to basically map the x rotation to the y rotation of the joint when I parent constrain it, and that's not going to be a problem. It's only when things are diagonal that I'm going to start to run into issues, and I will explain here in a second. Okay, now comes the tricky part for putting the controls on this one. And so there's a little bit more of an advanced setup that you need to do for this, especially using the AM control dock or the control dock curve script over here. What we're going to do is we're going to use a cog, and instead of normally orphaning like I've been doing, I'm actually going to make it a child of this joint. Now the reason I'm going to do this is because I'm going to have to group the control and then unparent that whole group so that the group will inherit this this axis angle. So let me show you what happens when you do it the wrong way first. So normally we would just do this. We'd be like, oh, okay, I'm just going to orphan the cog and I'm going to scale it up. And you're like, oh, okay, great. And then I'm going to rotate the curve, so that the control lines up with it. And like, oh, hey, awesome, everything's good. It's right where I want it. Awesome. Deselect it, right? Good object mode. I'm like, oh, okay, great. Oh, I gotta freeze my transforms. All right, so I'm gonna go modify and pay attention to the orientation here. Now all of a sudden, if I want to rotate this thing right down that axis, I got to use two or three axes to do it. It's nigh impossible to animate like that. So the fix for this is making a group and creating what's called a rotate offset. So this is the way you do it. So I'm going to select the joint and then I'm going to hit child, and you're going to see temporarily it's going to put the curve underneath it, and I'm going to scale it up the size that I want, and then deselect, and I'm going to group it before I do anything to it. So I'm going to select the curve and I'm going to group it. Then this null node I am going to rotate to get the orientation that I get it to line up with the direction that I want. All right, so notice the curve, when I select the curve, its rotations are all still 0, everything's lining up perfect. The group is basically offsetting its rotation. Then I'll probably name it and I'll just call it rotate offset. Then I'm going to ungroup it. So I'm going to unparent it. Look at all of these. Let me undo that. See how this is all 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and then negative 90? Watch what happens when I unparent it. When I unparent it from the joint, in order for it to maintain its position in space and its rotation, it gives that information to that group node from that joint. So now, all I have to do, because I'm never going to select this rotate offset, is I just grab these and I lock them. Because I'm never going to key it, I'm never going to use it. And now I can just parent this underneath my main control. And when I select this, not a big deal. So if I want to parent constraint, I do not parent constraint this. I never touch this again. I parent constraint this. So I'm going to grab parent, child, constrain, make sure everything's legit here. Okay, apply. And now, when I rotate this, hey, nice and easy rotation. And when I put it back to 0, it goes back to my initial setup. Very, very useful. Okay, I'm gonna do it one more time I'm just gonna go through the process so you'll see me do it. Here we go. All right, so now I just got to go through and set up all my constraints, and my rig will be finished. Here we go. Okay, so last notation is putting limits on these controls so that my animator can't do something like this to break it. So maybe I don't want to break it, I want to keep it stiff, right? Or I don't want to give the animator the capacity to be able to do that. I just want, every time you select this and you drag in here, for it to do the one direction. So I only want it to rotate on the Y. Well, what I can do is I can select all of these, but the Y. I can right click on this and I can just lock it. So it won't allow it to key. So you see, I can't move it this way, I can't move it this way, I can only move it that way. And then you can also lock and hide these if you don't ever want them to show up in the channel box. So as an example, I know I want it to rotate on the X. So I'm going to get rid of that. And this time I'm going to right click, lock and hide, and you see it all goes away. And so now the only control I have is that one. So I can click anywhere in here and free rotate, drag, and it'll rotate. So that can make animation much simpler. And again, I can do the same thing with this one. This is Y rotate, right? Y rotate. If I don't want to make it, give it the ability to do this kind of crazy stuff. You know, again, depending on the need of the rig and what you're doing. The other nice part about this, since everything is now zeroed, is I should just be able to grab those and do this. And everything goes back to zero space. Hopefully that was helpful, everybody. And let me know if you have any questions.